My name's Heather Meeker. I'm going to be talking today about a new organization, which is the Rocky Enterprise Software Foundation, and then also making some observations about stewardship of open source projects. If you were coming here today expecting to see Greg, I apologize that I'm not Greg, but hopefully I can provide you with some interesting information anyway. A little bit about me. I'm an attorney and I'm a venture capitalist in both respects, specializing in open source software. And there is a reason I'm telling you this, by the way, other than just self-promotion. The venture capital fund that I am part of is called OSS Capital, and it only invests in commercial open source software development. So we have a deep interest in the question of stewardship of open source projects. Is that? I don't think that's me. Okay, cool. Let's get going. So let's talk a little bit about what open source means to people, which is not quite the same thing as defining it. It's about freedom. You can use software for any purpose. I think we're all familiar with that. It's about lack of restrictions. There seems to be a lot of noise. I don't know why that is. Didn't sound like popping peas to me, no. It's something else. Well.
I don't hear it, but do you want to use the mic instead, the microphone?
Can you can still hear me now? Okay, let's try that. Maybe that's better. There is a problem with these wearable mics that no clothes normally worn by women have pockets, and so we have a hard time figuring out where to hang this stuff. Okay, so open source is unrestricted. Again, do whatever you like with it. Now we get into something a little bit different, which is transparency. So this has to do a little bit more with how projects are run than the actual licenses themselves. So the licenses, which is what I've spent a lot of my career dealing with, they get us to a certain level of what we're looking for with open source projects, but they don't get us all the way there. And the reason they don't is that it also matters how the project is stewarded. And you can have an open source license and problematic stewardship, and that won't get you to these goals. And you can have actually a non-open source license, and good stewardship might actually get you to a lot of these goals. But transparency is one of the most important things about stewardship of projects, and one of the things that the community greatly values. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. Stability. Okay, obviously no license could provide stability, but one of the great things about the open source development model is that it tends to be resistant to forking, obviously not completely resistant to forking, but it also tends to make people coalesce around something that is sort of standardized, as opposed to going off and doing all of their own sort of proprietary versions of things. So that's an important aspect of open source. And a little bit ironically, the licenses allow you to fork all you want, right? But in fact, the way that the open source development model works is actually kind of resistant to forking. And finally, trust. When you're running an open source project, it is absolutely important that you maintain the trust of the community, and if you don't maintain the trust of the community, you haven't done your job. Trust is what keeps open source projects together, and it's what keeps user base and developer base together. And of course, community. You have to pay attention to your community. That means you're not just developing for one group of people, you're developing as much as possible for the entire community of people who are interested in the project. So with these goals in mind, let's talk about what makes for a good steward of an open source project. Now, you know, I've been involved in lots of decisions personally about how to structure stewardship of open source projects, and often for my clients, but often also for community organizations who, you know, have asked my advice on it. And there are many ways to steward an open source project. These are probably the most popular ones. I'm going to talk about each one of those individually. So the classic open source project is there's no legal entity behind it at all. It's just individuals banding together and working on a project. And it works very well in some situations and not so well in other situations, but one of the wonderful benefits of that is that you don't have to do anything to set it up. It's just people come together, somebody puts some code out into the world, people start contributing, they're all collaborating, and everything's great. But there are some issues that can come up, and one of those issues is kind of a technical legal issue, which is that it's actually very important what projects are called, and that everybody in the community knows what the official project is. In legal terms, that is a trademark issue or a branding issue, and it's actually difficult for people to enforce trademark rights if there's no entity to enforce it. So if I'm running a project and all of you are collaborating with me and we're all contributing to the project, and the project is called, I don't know, Banana, right? Then what Banana is something that is actually stewarded by those running the project. But if a bad actor starts calling their project Banana, and let's say it's poor quality project, or they've forked it and they haven't done things right, then we would probably want to stop them from calling the project that, because it would create confusion and it would cause our community to lose trust in us because they might mistake that project for ours. Legally, those are trademark rights, and if you have just a loose amalgamation of people and no entity, it can be very hard to go through a formal legal process to enforce those rights. So that is a reason why the sort of laissez-faire, no entity approach might not work so well. Also, from a legal point of view, this doesn't come up very much, so I wouldn't, you know, classify it as important as the branding issue. But when you get together and you work on a project and you don't have a legal entity behind it, whether that be a corporation or an LLC or some other kind of legal entity, what's happening there is a partnership. It's a de facto partnership. And that can be an issue if something that the project does actually causes some harm. And, because the rule under law for partnerships is that every partner is liable for all of the liability of the endeavor. So that's why if you say start a business, you will find a lawyer probably telling you have to create an entity, because otherwise you'll create a de facto partnership and you'll be responsible for what all your partners do. And most people are not really comfortable with that. So those are some potential legal issues with the traditional no entity laissez-faire approach. And then there is a standalone not-for-profit foundation approach. So this approach has been popular over the years. These have come and gone. They mostly are not as popular as the community foundation, which we'll talk about in a bit, but it's kind of the next step in terms of complexity. So you create an organization, and that organization runs the project. By the way, it also usually owns the trademark rights associated with the project. You wouldn't be surprised to hear. But it's normally a not-for-profit foundation. Okay, so what does that mean? I think everybody, whether you're a lawyer or not, you probably think of nonprofit mostly as you can give donations to the organizations and to the organization, and it's tax deductible. That is part of it, but it's not exactly how it works. So you can set up an entity that doesn't have owners, stockholders, and whatnot, and just has a board of directors. You can set that up in California, Delaware, other places, and these are called non-stock entities, and they are usually not-for-profit foundations. But not-for-profit is actually a designation of the IRS under 501c of the tax code that, that says that if the organization makes money, it doesn't have to pay tax on it within a bunch of restrictions. So, but the thing is that there have been a lot of open source organizations that have sprung up over the years that have been not-for-profit entities that never had IRS status. The point was that they were messaging that it wasn't the entity, the point of the entity wasn't to make money, because the default under law is that if you create a business entity, the point of it is supposed to be that you're making money. So there were various individual organizations for specific projects that were created over the years that were not-for-profit foundations. So that addressed some of the issues with the no entity approach. Also, by the way, having a separate legal entity means it's a lot easier for corporate contributors to collaborate and give money to the project. You can imagine that if, enormous company and big company are working on a project together, it might be kind of awkward, and say they're competitors, which, and this happens a lot, by the way. It would be awkward for enormous co to accept monetary contributions from big co, right? So if you create a separate entity, then they can all contribute to it, and there are less concerns, tends to allay antitrust concerns and concerns like that. So those things work very well. The problem is that there's a lot of setup involved, and most open source projects just don't have the resources to do this. This has mostly been done by large projects that were funded by big companies. And then there's the community not-for-profit, which is, like Linux Foundation, Apache Foundation. So that's a community organization, same kind of structure, usually a not-for-profit entity, that that allows projects to become member projects of the organization. And I think if you look out at the way things are done today, and you ask most people who are running open source projects, what kind of entity do you think you should have? This is what comes to mind first for them, because by joining that organization, they can take advantage of the nonprofit status. And that brings with it the ability to accept donations, but perhaps more importantly, getting discounts on services and so forth, and having a way to have a clearinghouse for funding of the organizations. So one of the things that has caused some concern in the community is that these are kind of paid-to-play organizations. So the way it works is that if you want to become a member of the organization for a particular project, you pay membership dues, and then you usually, in return, you get a seat at the table on the governance committee or on a similar committee. It's not a board of directors because it's usually not a separate entity, but it's usually a government. Yes, we have a question.
Yeah, actually more of a statement.
Do you want to take questions now?
It's fine. I'll just repeat so that people listening can hear.
Yeah, just you're lumping ASF in with Linux Foundation, and pay-for-play is totally correct for Linux Foundation and totally wrong for Apache.
Oh, okay, good comment. So the comment was that the pay-for-play approach is correct for Linux Foundation, but not so much for Apache Foundation. Fair enough. There are actually kind of a few organizations that are community organizations. I would say most of them work on a pay-to-play basis. But each one has their own rules about what projects that they will accept. But the idea is the project comes in under the aegis of the organization. And then if you go kind of in the other direction, you've got the private company. And so, of course, that's the situation I'm dealing with a lot, which is that you have a private company, which is a for-profit company that's stewarding the project. And this has become much more popular lately. one of the reasons is that there have been ongoing concerns about sustainability of open source projects and funding. And so corporate sponsorship or corporate development of open source has become a lot more popular in the past, say, 10 years than it had been before. The problem with that, of course, is that those are subject to what we call fiduciary interests. So the company is running the open source project, but it also it has to have a duty to its shareholders, to its owners, to make money. And so that can create friction between operating for the benefit of the community and operating for the benefit of the shareholders. And you know, in the investments that we do, we're always looking at how to balance this line, because a successful open source business has to take both of them into account. And then finally, there's a category called a public benefit corporation, which is kind of a newly emerging category. It's been around a little while, but it's gotten a little more popular. And this is a corporation that runs for the benefit of the world at large instead of for the benefit of the shareholders. So it's a little more like not-for-profit, but it's not really about tax status. And there's also, by the way, an organization that certifies corporations, it's called B Corp, that certifies organizations who do this. It's a little confusing, but a public benefit corporation doesn't need that certification, and you don't need to be a public benefit corporation to get B Corp certified. So they're slightly different things. Anyway, sorry, that's a lot of information and kind of general, but I wanted to give the lay of the land for how people think about how open source projects find homes. Do they not find a home at all? They don't care? Or do they find a home within a specific not-for-profit, a community not-for-profit, a private company, or B Corp? Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about Rocky Enterprise Software Foundation and how it came about, and it's a really interesting case study for how private company management can experience road bumps in project management. And by the way, I want to start this by saying this is not a criticism of Red Hat at all. It's more like an observation about what happened and why it happened, and so that, you know, we can draw from that, you know, our own conclusions about how to manage projects and what happens if there are challenges to managing the project. So I'm sure many of you in the audience know way more about this than I do, so feel free to make comments, but a little bit of background for those who aren't familiar. So CentOS started as a build of Linux that was started by Gregory Kurtzer. He is the person who was going to speak here today, and I substituted for him. And the person who started Rocky Enterprise Software Foundation. So he was instrumental in putting together the CentOS project, and then Red Hat became a sponsor of it in 2014 and was a very successful sponsor of it for a long time. The project was extraordinarily successful. You know, as I said, I'm a lawyer working in open source software licensing, and I have counseled many clients on using CentOS in their products. Is extremely popular, and the reason it was so popular and successful was, you know, a project with a lot of interested community members, and it had a home, which was Red Hat was stewarding it, but it also had some qualities that people really liked that we'll talk about in a bit. But the difference between CentOS and Red Hat's product was Red Hat's project is called Red Hat Enterprise Linux. That's a product that you actually buy services from Red Hat to, you know, updates and maintenance support, et cetera. I'm describing it in a very general way. There's more to it than that. But so RHEL has corporate support, right? CentOS was a community project that didn't have commercial support, at least not from Red Hat, which was fine. That was the whole point. RHEL was the commercial product, and CentOS was the community project. The thing was that CentOS was downstream from RHEL, meaning that changes were road tested within RHEL and then went into the CentOS project. And that element of how it worked was hugely important to people in the community, and it was one of the reasons why CentOS was so incredibly popular. It was, it had been road tested by the time changes got into the CentOS code base, and it was widely used by lots of people. And then in 2021, Red Hat discontinued CentOS in favor of something called CentOS Stream, which was actually an upstream distribution. So it meant that the new CentOS Stream, was not the downstream road-tested version that people had relied on. Yeah?
So at some point, Red Hat got full control of CentOS.
Well, they were managing the project. It was a community project, but they were stewarding it. I think that's the right way to say it.
They have enough influence to pull the plug, though.
I'm sorry?
They have enough influence to pull the plug.
Yeah, they had enough influence to pull a plug, and also this was part of their, it was just part of their business model, and they changed that. Yeah. Yeah, so the comment was that they fired everyone who was a volunteer. Oh, hired, sorry. They had, that's right. That's a good point. Thanks for pointing that out. They had hired the community volunteers who were working on CentOS. So that's how they got effective control of the project, by supporting it by hiring volunteers. So then they made a change in their business, and they changed how CentOS was used in their business. By the way, Greg was one of those people, of course. And so now we went from a downstream version, which had been road tested, to an upstream version, and people were very concerned about that. So downstream was CentOS and upstream was CentOS Stream. So one of the issues was that when this was announced, there was huge consternation in the community. And one of the reasons for that, which I'll talk about in a moment, is that there was this idea of where the kind of end of life of CentOS was going to be, and the assumptions sort of changed on a dime. So there was actually quite a bit of concern over this announcement. You can see the 717 comments on this announcement in December 2020. When this happened, by the way, I had several clients call me in a panic. So, that's, people were very concerned about the change and how they were going to react to the change, particularly people who were using CentOS in consumer products. So as I mentioned, CentOS was downstream and not road tested. It was extremely popular, including with custom Linux development. So it was particularly popular with people who were doing custom Linux for devices, or for applications that wouldn't enjoy broad support, so specific to their products. Also, there was a feeling that the wider community was surprised by the change, and so they had to scramble to react to it. And there was a perception that CentOS then provided less benefit to the community because it wasn't downstream anymore. And so some people reacted to this by saying, this is a problem with corporate control of open source projects. This is the kind of thing that can happen because priorities change within a company, and all of a sudden the community is not considered, the community suffers, or at least that was the perception. And here were the things that the community was concerned about. They were expecting a certain lifespan for the latest version of CentOS that accelerated the end of life of that version, and that obviously played havoc with people's expectations about using CentOS in their products. It was also as I mentioned, an extremely popular project. It was everywhere, and there were some, of course, it's very hard to count the use of open source software the way you count proprietary software, but one estimate was that 20% of enterprise resources were running on CentOS, so that was really significant, not only for the people using it, but just for the technology landscape generally. And that it hurt the community's trust of commercially driven open source projects. So it called into question whether the corporate control of open source project met the objectives that I talked about in the beginning. It was freely available, but the relationship with the community got damaged. So sometimes it kind of seemed like a little bit of a fight between the company and the community. So the CentOS community reacted quickly, and I remember the first client who called me about this. I had not seen the announcement, and then they told me about the announcement, and we looked at it together, and I said, this is not exactly a brilliant conclusion, it's very obvious, is, well, somebody's going to take that project over. And so, because that's what usually happens with a popular project. If it's stewarded by a company and the company goes in a direction that is not, that the community doesn't like, it usually gets forked or taken over by other people. So, but within 2 hours after the announcement, Greg offered to build and fund a replacement operating system, and immediately and this is what ended up being Rocky Enterprise Linux Foundation, Software Foundation. Immediately people started helping and contributing because of their, how much they liked CentOS. And in less than 2 months, they had 10,000 volunteers. So this caused Rocky Linux to be born, but they were concerned, Greg was concerned about making sure that he didn't ever lose the trust of the community and wondered how to go about that. So he started thinking about what kind of organization would be best to do that. And that's how we came up with Rocky Enterprise Software Foundation. The vision of Rocky Enterprise Software Foundation is to create and nurture a community of individuals and organizations committed to ensuring the longevity, stewardship, and innovation of enterprise-grade open source software that is always freely available. So with their eyes on the prize, they started setting up the structure. Now, importantly, the Rocky Enterprise Software Foundation bylaws contain a lot of detail about the objectives of the organization. Usually when you set up a corporation, you don't really say very much about it. You say, well, we're going to, it's like one sentence, right? We're going to create robots, or we're going to create a social media site, or whatever it is. But for the bylaws for Rocky Enterprise Linux Foundation, we actually sat down and thought carefully about what we needed to promise the community in order to regain trust and reorient the goals of the project. And these are some of the aspects that we thought about. Community responsibility. The foundation is run for the benefit of the public community, and it is a self-imposed not-for-profit organization. In other words, it's not a 501c3, 501c6, but it says we're going to run as a volunteer nonprofit organization, meaning we volunteer not to make any money, and that's okay with the owner, who started the organization. They committed to free open source and reproducible projects. So only OSI approved, and also permissive licensing where possible. That was a decision made by the organization. Obviously, some other organizations use different licensing models. The foundation will build, host, and adopt open source projects. So its flagship project is Rocky Linux, but it also is open to adopting other projects. It'll remain transparent to the community, and it won't be pay to play. That was one of the things that was most important to the people organizing the organization, that you have to you have to earn your place in the organization by participating instead of by contributing money. And it's a merit-based process. So why does this work, or why should it work? This is kind of a new approach. First, when you form a company, the company has to actually abide by what it says in its bylaws. It has a legal obligation to do that. And so what this organization has done is said, we created a regular company, but what we've done is we have kind of rewritten the rules of running a company, and this is what we are going to do because we want the company to be serving the community as opposed to a set of owners. It's a little more flexible than a 501c3. I won't bend your ear too much about this, but there was a time when the IRS kind of stopped approving open source organizations as 501c3s. So a 501c3 is a public charity. So, think about, a charity that gives away money, and that's kind of the quintessential 501c3. The original open source organizations like Linux Foundation, Free Software Foundation, Mozilla, Apache, are all C3s. And they were, sorry.
Linux Foundation C6.
Oh, I'm sorry, Linux Foundation C6. Sorry about that. And you're right, because it was later.
It was OSDL, and then it became Linux Foundation.
Yeah, so there was a time when the IRS was accepting 501c3s from open source organizations, and all of the earlier open source organizations were 3Cs and C3s, and then we went into a time when the IRS was actually pretty hostile to open source organizations and would not approve them as C3s, and then people tried getting them approved as C6. Okay, C6 is a trade organization. As you said, this is what Linux Foundation is, and this is actually what most open source nonprofits are at this point. When when an organization tries to get status from the IRS, they usually try to get C6 status. But it's gotten easier, but it's still not maybe as easy as it should be. So a little bit of history there. There was this mini scandal in the IRS. I don't know how many of you remember this, but it was actually associated with Tea Party organizations, and I think it's about 12 years ago. I'm maybe getting that wrong. But the IRS had a BOLO, be on the lookout for certain kinds of organizations applying for nonprofit status, and they would flag those, and they would, they would subject them to great scrutiny and usually reject them. I personally had a client who spent 7 years litigating their nonprofit status with the IRS. Very unfortunate, as like kind of a traditional open source software development organization. And so then when that scandal broke, there were some changes at the IRS, and it got better and it got easier, and now people can usually get organizations approved as C6s. But it's still a lot of work, and you need to usually hire people who are specialists in doing that kind of work. And I assure you, like, unlike a lot of other lawyers, they don't work for free. And so it's expensive, time-consuming. It takes usually at least 9 months to a year to get the status from the IRS. So a lot of work doing that, and it's easier to just create a regular company and write your bylaws. So that's one of the elements, that's driving how to think about creating entities for this kind of situation. Also, in American business, there has been a movement towards this notion of stakeholder capitalism, and if you look at what people are talking about business, the way people think about business today is greatly different from what it was 20 years ago. Like 20 years ago, this sort of normal assumption that companies they run for the benefit of their shareholders, they're out there to make money, maybe they give money to charity, but that's actually kind of considered marketing, right? But now people are moving to the idea that maybe companies should be run differently, not just for the benefit of the shareholders, maybe for the benefit of the community too. And that's why you're seeing public benefit corporations and B Corp and so forth. Those structures and that organization are responding to the social changes in the community that are demanding different things from companies. You know, just to give a little bit of color about this, you know, I've been working as a corporate lawyer for nearly 30 years, and like the notion that companies would be about something other than making money for their shareholders, it seemed a little bizarre to me at first, because when you run a company, say you're on the board of directors for a company, there is an extremely important legal obligation to run that for the benefit of the shareholders. That is the #1 fiduciary duty involved in corporations. So the idea that a private company would not run for benefit of shareholders is kind of it's kind of a revolutionary idea, but if you see people talking about corporate law and social change, you'll see that they're making a lot of comments like this. RESF has a board of directors, including people that you might know. We've been recently populating the board of directors. I'm very happy to have some leading lights working with us. Also, projects can join RESF. This is a situation where if a project wants to join, they would reach out to the foundation and have a talk with them. If you want to participate as opposed to, finding a home for a project there, the foundation has suggestions about how to get involved, which shouldn't surprise anybody here. Get involved on discussions, become a contributor, and then if you're interested in moving a project there, you complete an application form and they'll review the application. But it's not pay to play, it's kind of probably more like Apache is in the sense of there's a judgment about whether it's a proper project for the foundation. Okay, a few lessons for commercial open source companies before I end. So as I told you, I approach this as an investor and as a business lawyer mostly, and there's, I think, a kind of a misunderstanding about, certainly amongst lots of investors and business people, about what it means to run a commercial organization that is built around an open source project. So a lot of people think that the open source element is just kind of a try before you buy thing or a loss leader. And it does have that aspect to it, but if you run the project that way in a corporate setting, you're not going to be successful. Yeah, did you have a comment?
Wizards of the Coast just learned.
Sorry?
Wizards of the Coast.
Oh, Wizards of the...
Subsidiary of Hasbro that maintains Dungeons and Dragons.
Oh, yeah.
They changed their licensing and have gotten terrible, terrible trouble. It's an excellent example if you want to talk to a corporation about how they should deal with their ecology.
Yeah, it's an interesting comment. So there was a license change recently for Dungeons and Dragons. Actually, the license for that's very interesting, but I could talk for an hour about that. But it didn't work out well, let's say. The thing is that when companies view their open source community as just kind of pawns to go out and sell products, that's kind of a Band-Aid, right? And it doesn't tend to work out well in the long term. If you really want to create a successful corporate open source project, then you have to pay attention to the community and understand that the community is just as big an asset as your paying customers are. And many companies either can't kind of get into that mindset, or else they're in that mindset, but their investors can't get into that mindset. And that's one of the reasons our fund exists, is like we don't want our companies to ever be at cross purposes with us about the fact that we want them to be developing open source software and serving the community. So it's really, need to be really careful about decisions that will alienate your community base, and you need to treat the open source community as the asset that it is. Yeah.
What lessons, so we keep talking about all the things that Red Hat should have done differently. What should the people who use CentOS have done differently that might have avoided the decisions that they made?
So the question is, what could the people involved in CentOS, not Red Hat, have done in order to avoid the problems that happened? That's a really good question. I'm not really sure there's an easy answer to that, because there's always a tension between corporate support of projects because they have money and resources and can hire the developers, and the community focus. Yeah. Okay.
You can have a talk next year.
Well, I'm sorry, this is very one-sided.
Right, okay. Go ahead.
Okay, well, I'm almost done, so we'll talk about that. As I said, if you run a cost project and you don't treat your community properly, you're not going to thrive, and the product will get privatized, and you really have to think about the community as a separate asset of the business. So that's the end of my talk. I hope it was thought-provoking and interesting. Thank you so much for all the wonderful comments. I really appreciate it. We'll take maybe a few more questions. We have time. But before I do that, I just want to mention that my book is available free on my website. If you like, you can go and you sign up for a little mailing list, which, by the way, I almost never use, so I won't spam you. And then you can see where to download a digital copy of the book and some related forms and so forth. This book is for people who are in business, who are trying to figure out how to integrate open source into their business. Not so much about technology, but about the business and licensing aspects of it. I am also working on a new book because I told my husband if I tried to write a new book, he should kill me, but he didn't. So a new book is coming, and it's actually more focused on building businesses around open source software. So that should be coming out, I don't know, in a few months. We'll see how much I get on the stick to finish it, but it's should be interesting with a slightly different focus. That is it. And so why don't we take a few questions?
Round of applause, please, first for Heather. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I had a question about the move from being an organization in service of one project to kind of becoming a community organization, and if you just had any thoughts about that process in general.
Yeah, so Linux Foundation kind of did that. I mean, and they did it in spades. I mean, they're like incredibly successful at doing that. There's a lot more overhead and process to running, to being responsible for multiple projects instead of one. And the one that is probably the most crucial, although there are many, is that you have to think about how the funding is going to work. So if you're taking donations or membership fees for one project, it's pretty easy to figure out, okay, all that money should be spent on the project or conferences or whatever you're spending it on. Once you get more than one project, then you have to think about how do we earmark or allocate funds for different projects. And you have to do that in a way that's fair based on the projects and who's contributing and who contributing money, contributing resources. And so that's probably the most work, is to figure out that structure. Now, Linux Foundation does that through this Series LLC structure. So they actually create a different entity for every project. But you don't have to do it that way. That's the way they did it. So yeah, figuring out the finances is hugely important. Usually, umbrella organizations will allow projects to do their own governance for the most part, or they take a very light hand with it. They might say you have to use this license, like Apache Foundation, everything's under Apache license. There are some foundations who are kind of more laissez-faire about it. So there's that aspect, like what do you want to encourage in terms of licensing, permissive versus copyleft and so forth. But the money, you got to follow the money first.
Go here and then behind.
Thanks. So I work for a company called Gradle, or the Gradle build tool for those of us who know that. And we have an interesting business model in that we have our open source side of our business, and that's the popular Gradle build tool. And then we have an unfortunately named product called Gradle Enterprise, which everybody sort of assumes is like open core Gradle because of its naming. But it's actually not. It's a completely separate product. It doesn't have any of Gradle's source code in it. We don't benefit on the Gradle Enterprise side necessarily when someone makes contributions to the open source side of the business. And I come from a time of, yeah, well, the question is, you had a statement about the amount that you're free to use your build tool as a marketing tool for the commercial side of the business. And I'm curious if you think that those parameters are different when you don't have an open core model.
Yeah, so by the way, first I'll say that the branding issue is super important. Like, the number one, I'm not saying that your company's made a mistake. I'm not saying that at all. But I just want to communicate that when companies come to me, either as a lawyer or as an investor, and the biggest mistake they make is branding mistakes, because they're a little hard to recover from. Like, once people know something under a particular name, you usually don't want to rebrand. And so it's important to do a lot of really careful thinking about if you're going to have open core, like what are you going to call the different things, and how are you going to express their relationship to each other, because that can actually be very confusing to people. By the way, I would say that in the long run, although it's a little harder, it's much better to have a different brand for your commercial product and your open source project. The clients I've worked with and businesses I've worked with that have done the best in branding usually have completely different brands. But of course, that means you're selling two different brands at once, so that can be a little bit difficult. You could definitely have something that's open source and something like complementary that's proprietary, and they might not be like the same thing or much related to each other. And by the way, almost every company has that if you take a 50,000-foot view, because a lot of the companies that are producing a lot of open source these days are actually regular businesses who just release open source code that is not like a competitive differentiator for their company. And that's perfectly legitimate because it's gotten us a tremendous amount of wonderful code out there. So if you look at it, writ large, every business does that. So then you have to think, okay, what is the relationship between these things? What do we want people to think about it? I mean, my view is, it's perfectly fine to do it however you want to, but the branding is important. You have to make sure that you're not confusing people about it. And by the way, every company that I work with who does open core, I encourage them to write licensing FAQs and branding FAQs, because you have to educate your community and your customer base about what the relationship between the two is.
So I applaud you for using what I would call the bronze standard for organizational formation. And you pointed out that the gold standard for a short period of time forming a 501c3 was not available. Given that those issues have been fully addressed and people can get 501c3 organizations for this kind of activity, why not use the gold standard so that you have the 501c3 rules making sure that the bylaws can't be changed and they can't start to act not in the public good? Why not use a C3 at this point now that it's available again?
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with using a C3, and The pay-to-play approach is not necessarily coincident with C3, so you could have, a C3 that ran differently. I would say there's no reason not to create a C3, except that it's a lot of work for some people to do. So some people just want to be more nimble and set something up quickly. By the way, it's not too difficult to create a private entity like a regular company and then roll the assets into a C3. It's nearly impossible to go the other direction, right? So, yeah. So that can definitely be done if the C3 ends up being the right thing to do. But my point was that when people think about C3s, interestingly, even though what C3 is about is tax status, that's not exactly what people are looking for. What they're looking for is trust in running the project for the community, and C3 is one vehicle to get there, but it's not exactly the same as the tax status.
I have a question.
Huh?
Is Rocky Enterprises that based in Colorado?
Yeah. Well, certain people involved are based in Colorado. I have to say that I hardly have a client or a portfolio company that's based anywhere anymore. So, yes.
So can I clarify something? Because in full
Of course.
disclosure, I am not a Red Hat employee, but I was when this happened.
Okay, well, eager
so-
to hear what you have to say.
I'm largely, I think, in a lot of areas in agreement with you about the trust issues with open source, especially around open core type things and where source gets closed off. Red Hat has never stopped publishing the source to RHEL. It has always been available. What we're really talking about is convenience. And we keep talking about trust. And trust works both ways. If I come over to your house every weekend and I bring a 6-pack of beer, right? You might like that a lot, and you might think that's great, and then one weekend I don't bring it, and you say I don't trust you anymore because you didn't bring free beer anymore. That is essentially, to me, what this conversation has been.
Well, maybe you can have that debate with somebody from Red Hat and CentOS, perhaps.
Well, I would say, by the way, first of all, Red Hat is, probably the greatest open source business on the planet, right? I mean, it was the business that proved you could run a business around open source. And it did that because, and I have like immense respect for them and their business model and the fact that they have resisted going to open core proprietary. It's fantastic, right? This is not a criticism of them, really. It's more like, I think, a cautionary tale. One of the things about Red Hat is that it's built around the biggest open source project on the planet, right? It's one reason it's been so successful, and why people say there's only one Red Hat and everything. But the point is that even micro changes, when the project is writ that large, can have a bunch of ripples. And so I think for people running open source projects in business, this is it's a lesson to be learned about community management. And it may be impossible to ever to avoid ever making a step that would make communities unhappy. By the way, communities have a tremendous capacity to be unhappy. and Red Hat's a business, right? So they, get to run the business model the way they would, but the way they want to. But it's just so important that you pay attention to how your business policies are going to affect the community.
I just wanted to comment that I think on the side of the open source foundations and open source projects, that there's a lot to be said for being very, very careful not to be captured by your partners. And that's all I really have to say on that.
Fair comment. Anyone else?
Any more? We have time. I think we have maybe 6 more minutes till this is technically over.
Okay.
Are there any plans for Rocky to diverge from Rel anyway, or is Rocky always going to be like a 1-1?
Okay, the question is whether Rocky is going to diverge from RHL. I unfortunately don't know the answer to that question. If Greg were here, he might be able to answer, but I can't.
I think Greg would be the perfect one to answer the Red Hat CentOS debate maybe as well.
Well, it's definitely near and dear to his heart. Well, one more?
I'll run fast. I could use some exercise anyway.
So I have a trademark legal question. Why do you still say Rocky Enterprise Software Foundation TM after the trademark's been registered? Why not the Circle R?
Why not what?
Why not the Circle R?
Oh, Circle R is when you've got a registration. TM is before you have a
Okay, but
registration.
y'all registered the trademark on February 23rd.
I don't know what the status of it is, but it's not.
I just looked in tests. It was registered on the 23rd.
Is it registered?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe that was like after I did the slides.
A race condition.
Well, so anyway, thank you so much for your kind attention and the great questions, which I really appreciate. And I'm going to be around for a while if anybody wants to chat about this kind of thing or open source and business generally, because that's pretty much what I live and breathe. Have a great time at the conference and enjoy your day.